Hello, friends I made this for. Let's start with a big misnomer. Yes, you should buy your own deck. You can do whatever the fuck you want. And here are some tips to picking your perfect first tarot deck if you haven't done it yet. Or maybe you've gotten a deck and you just didn't connect to it, right? That happens all the time. I've bought decks in the past that I thought looked really amazing online, or I bought them in person and then opened them up, did some clearing, did some cleansing, sat them on my altar for a few days, finally got to handling them and went, it's not for me. And that's okay, because that's part of the experience, right? We learn through our experiences with the tarot. So if you're just getting into tarot or you want to find a new deck, here are some tips and some ideas to open up when you're getting into it. So, happy holidays to your fucking self, because you deserve to buy a fucking deck that you fucking love. Let me first start by saying that I see decks in 3 different main categories. There's the mass-produced or classic-ish decks. This can be anything from the Cosmic Tarot to the Smith-Waite deck, which is absolutely great if you're a beginner, if I'm being completely honest. And then there are decks that are considered quote-unquote indie, right? They're created by small creators like myself. Apparition, a Spirit Speak Tarot deck is a really great one as well. And there are some card decks that fall in between that, those of course being the Wild Unknown Tarot, which to me is borderline classic and indie because it is mass produced. You can get this on Amazon. And then last but not least is the Oracle kind of tarot decks. So I'm going to just quickly explain why each of these decks have some strengths, some weaknesses, and how to find a deck that you like. So first and foremost, I do recommend if you're getting your very first ever deck to get it in person, right? It's most good to connect on an energetic level to your deck, and that's easiest to do when you can hold it in said hands. Also, being able to hold the actual deck in your hands is really nice because you might find that you either like the cardstock or you might not. It might feel really good to shuffle or it might not. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is, yes, you should connect to the art of your deck. The art of your deck can give you a really great insight into how you will connect with the deck. I personally bought this deck because I love the art, so I went for it. I also am a reader for, a few years, so I connected to a deck that I thought looked like it represented the tarot as I knew it, as well as expanding upon the idea of this tarot. So that is also a pretty cool thing to do. But how does one decide how to get one's very first tarot deck, you might be asking? Well, baby witches, something that's really a great idea is honestly get the classic tarot deck first. I recommend it always because it gives you a good reference back into the history of the cards that you're using. So, I personally like the Smith-Waite version of the deck because I like the muted colors, and I also like the fact that it represents the original artist in the name a little better than some other renditions of these cards. So that's a really cool aspect of that deck, and I definitely recommend you look into it yourself because these kind of decks can give you a lot of good history, but they're also somewhat limiting, right? It might not even connect to you because everyone's white. So if that's the case, then I do recommend the Melanated Tarot because it's the very same imagery but with more variety of the types of people, especially if you are a person of color or you're black. You want to connect to your deck in a deck that represents you, and that's super fair and super valid. So I highly recommend you find the deck that connects to you and what you see as your tarot lineage, which is another bing, 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 big word. your lineage is going to be different from you to anyone else, right? You will connect differently to these cards than anyone else. You might want to buy books, or you might want to use the booklet that comes with your deck. If you have a booklet that comes with a deck like one of these, throw it away, it's trash. If you have a booklet that comes with a deck like this book that comes with this deck is actually not a bad buy. It goes with the deck, it comes complete in there, and it has some really beautiful insight. However, as someone who has read for a long time, you don't want to have to rely on a packet or a book. I recommend getting some of Rachel Pollack's books about tarot. 78 Degrees of Wisdom is a great one to dive into before you even get a deck if you just want to look into the magic of tarot. So, with that said, what are these 3 categories I said in the beginning, and why do they matter? So a mass-produced or a classic tarot deck is a deck to me that's been around for at least 2 decades, right? At least 2, so not really the Unknown Tarot. But this deck has been around since 1998. This deck is one of the oldest decks in the history of tarot, and so on and so forth. You also have decks like the Morgan Greer Tarot that, again, it's really classic imagery, and you can connect with it to kind of give you a baseline for what kind of deck would be good for you, right? This is one of my favorite decks of all time, honestly, because to me it just has really beautiful colors. I really like the artwork, though I will say it cuts off where some of this deck here does not. So that can be really helpful as far as getting a deck, just starting with a classic one first. Because from there, we can explore the art of the tarot and kind of build up and up. Now, indie tarot decks are really great, and they come in a few different forms, right? The Fountain Tarot, I think, is technically an indie deck. Even though it's mass-produced, you can also get this one on Amazon and most bookstores. There's some reasons why I'm not as big a fan of that one as I am the Apparition Tarot Spirit Speak Tarot. And that is because some of these cards simplify things way too much. If you're getting the Wild Unknown Tarot deck as your first tarot deck, and I've seen a lot of people do this, you're going to have a really hard time reading this deck without the booklet. If you decide to get this deck in tandem with this deck, you're going to have a little bit of an easier time. I would recommend, as you're moving through a deck like this or any indie tarot, that you take out a classic deck and see where the connections are, where the artist kind of created their own changes and took liberties, and where we see the lineage connect back to the classic tarot. So, not to say that indie decks are not a good idea for if you're first getting started, because I definitely think indie decks bring a lot to the table, such as this deck being one of my favorites. There's a lot of really good imagery in this deck, and I really think it has a lot to offer a new card reader. However, because you might be a new-ish reader, it might be important for you to make sure that you are getting all the information that you can as you begin your tarot journey. So, some decks that I would recommend as opposed to the Wild Unknown or the Fountain, where there's not as much information as you might like, I would recommend Apparition Spirit Speak Tarot deck or the Way Home Tarot. Those are great tarot decks that are good for beginners because they have a lot of information. Apparition Spirit Speak Tarot also comes with its own booklet that I think is really helpful. Again, though, I wouldn't recommend going with booklets that come with decks like this or even the Smith-Waite, because ultimately those little pamphlets are kind of limiting and they give bad information. As an intuitive reader, I don't always agree with the old school readings of cards, and especially the old school readings of, well, death is a spooky. It's not. So, with that said, the third category is, of course, Oracle tarot decks. Now, these are great. This is actually my first tarot deck that I ever got. But here's the truth. Oracle decks that are also tarot cards can be kind of limiting in the way that we see these certain cards, right? And they can also be confusing if you're just starting to get used to reading. Not always, though. This is Seven of Pentacles. And as we can see, Seven of Pentacles is well represented in this card with awaiting results. That makes sense, right? Two of Pentacles is finding balance in this deck. And of course, this deck also includes some different things, such as chakra cards that I think can be helpful. But as much as I love this deck, I love that this was my very first deck, it did not help me become a better tarot reader. I use this deck more for my clients when I'm working with people for Reiki sessions than anything else. I also use this card in circles when I'm working with groups of people. So it's an easy card for people to read. They can pull it out. You get opened up. That's pretty self-explanatory. Spread your wings. Pretty self-explanatory. Change your focus. Easy to understand, right? Even though this is Five of Cups, change your focus is still an interesting way to look at that. So it can be super helpful. But if you're looking at becoming a better reader or wanting to read tarot, I do not recommend an oracle deck, an oracle tarot deck, because it might also start to slip you up with thinking of cards in very flat ways of looking at them. So, with that said, those are my basic thoughts on different types of tarot decks. Like I said, you should also get into maybe buying your first one in person before starting to buy online from small creators, because I do believe, and I believe everyone should get a tarot deck that is an indie tarot deck for sure. It helps support small-time artists, but also you get an interesting new look at some old cards. So if you are interested in reading cards for the first time, maybe start with a classic deck before diving into a more complex looking tarot deck as well. Also keep in mind that certain ways that people interpret cards might not resonate with you, and that's totally fine. But with that said, that's my quickie dive into different types of decks. Depending on the type of deck you get, I recommend always cleansing your deck, maybe with some selenite, putting it on your altar, things like that, to get you connected in and clear every energy that might have come into contact with that deck before you. So, as you're getting into your tarot journey, witchy babies, remember, you can buy your own deck, connect it with it how you will, and if you don't find that a deck is supportive for you, let's say you bought it and you found that it just didn't vibe with you, you can always re-gift it. You can always give it to somebody else. It might have come to you first so that you could pass it along. And that's a really beautiful part of the lineage. So, for another day, I'll talk about oracle decks and indie oracles and how to pick an oracle deck that fits for you. But for all my babies looking to get into tarot, I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a beautiful day. And until next time, don't be a dick.